In the world of extreme wealth, sometimes all it takes is the right last name, absolute confidence, and a few well-connected people willing to vouch for you. The people on this list went far beyond simply exaggerating how much money they had. They invented entire personas built around wealth, complete with family histories, powerful connections, and fortunes that did not exist. And somehow, real bankers, investors, celebrities, and millionaires ended up believing them. The higher the ranking, the more convincing the identity, the longer it survived, and the further the impostor managed to take it. In 2015, a small expedition ship left Ushuaia for some of the most remote islands in the South Atlantic. Most of the passengers were affluent, middle-aged travelers willing to spend enormous sums for the chance to reach places almost no tourists ever see. One passenger stood out immediately. William Bakeland was only in his early 20s, yet he carried himself like someone for whom private expeditions to the edge of the map were perfectly routine. Bakeland said he came from a wealthy British family and was descended from Leo Bakeland, the chemist and entrepreneur who invented Bakelite, one of the first mass-produced plastics. He spoke about elite schools, dozens of countries he had visited, influential contacts, and his ability to arrange expeditions almost anywhere on Earth. In the tiny world of extreme travel, that kind of connection could be more valuable than money. Some destinations were so difficult to reach that simply being able to pay was not enough. His reputation grew quickly. Bakeland seemed to know geography inside out, and he offered trips to isolated islands and restricted regions that required permits, chartered vessels, and complicated logistics. His age did not make the story less believable. If anything, it added to the mystique. Here was a young heir with apparently unlimited resources, spending his life chasing places most people had never even heard of. Then the trips started going wrong. Expeditions were postponed or cancelled, and money paid in advance did not always come back. Travelers began comparing stories, documents, and old photographs. That was when the identity started to unravel. The aristocratic adventurer, known as William Bakeland, had previously been known as Jesse Gordon, a young man from an ordinary family near Birmingham. Bakeland was not just a random alias. Gordon had legally changed his name and built an entire background around it, one perfectly designed for the exclusive world of expensive exploration. Members of the travel community said the money paid for future expeditions ran into the hundreds of thousands. In the end, he was not exposed by a bank, a corporate security team, or a private intelligence firm. He was exposed by the travelers themselves, once they finally put the cancelled trips, old identities, documents, and photographs side by side. Nicholas Bryant did not borrow the name of a famous dynasty. His story was more ordinary, and that made it easier to believe. He said his parents were wealthy oil and gas investors and presented himself as a young businessman connected to successful companies. To people around him, that seemed to explain the private jets, luxury cars, expensive dinners, and the huge amounts of money apparently being spent on his home. The lifestyle, however, was funded mostly by promises that payment was on the way. According to federal prosecutors, Bryant exploited the delay built into electronic payment systems. A business would see what looked like confirmation that a transfer had been initiated, provide the service, and only later discover that the money had never arrived. By then, Bryant could already be somewhere else. Using this method, Bryant obtained more than a dozen private jet flights, a trip on a 90-foot yacht, luxury hotel stays, high-end meals, and vehicles worth more than $500,000. He even had construction started on a house, pool, and workshop worth roughly $980,000, despite having no reliable way to pay for it. To make the image more convincing, Bryant created fake companies and websites, and sometimes communicated with businesses while pretending to be people who did not exist. At one point, he told a company that his secretary would handle the payment. There was no secretary. In another case, a man who trusted Bryant through the oil and gas business gave him around $150,000 to help launch an oil well. The well turned out to be as fictional as much of the young heir's business empire. Federal prosecutors identified at least 56 victims over roughly a year and a half. Bryant eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. The judge went above the recommended sentencing range, specifically pointing to Bryant's attitude toward what he had done. Kristoff Roken understood something that many con artists never do. When one identity becomes dangerous, there is no reason to stop if you can simply become someone else. In the United States, the Frenchman appeared as a wealthy businessman, a film industry insider, a racing driver, a powerful European, and, when the situation called for it, a member of the Rockefeller family. In Los Angeles, Roken wore Armani, drove a Ferrari, and stayed at the Beverly Wilshire. One acquaintance, Hollywood stuntman Buddy Ochoa, later described the logic that made the illusion so effective. If a hotel like that was giving Roken an enormous suite, Ochoa assumed somebody important must already have checked him out. Roken took him shopping on Rodeo Drive and once showed him a gold bar at a jewelry store that he claimed to have bought for $1.5 million. Then came an investment opportunity in Japan. Roken promised to quadruple the money invested by Ochoa within weeks and wanted cash. Ochoa lost about $10,000. Another businessman, who owned luxury clothing stores, reportedly handed Roken more than $250,000 in cash, clothes, and vehicles. At another point, Roken talked about a perfume venture supposedly connected to Michael Jackson's family. Whenever one version of himself became too risky, another appeared. In New York, he was known as Christopher Rockefeller, a wealthy international financier. In Canada, he used yet another name while promising to invest millions in a local entrepreneur's company. Investigators said he took more than $1 million from affluent victims, while his unpaid bill at the Beverly Wilshire alone reportedly reached about $60,000. In 2004, Roken pleaded guilty in Los Angeles to passport fraud and received a 5-year sentence, which ran alongside sentences from his other U.S. cases. By then, the Rockefeller, the racing driver, and the wealthy producer had all vanished. What remained was Kristoff Roken, a man who could replace one rich persona with another faster than the people around him could verify any of them. In the 1870s, a mysterious Scottish aristocrat began moving through American high society under the name Lord Gordon. He claimed to own vast estates in Scotland and said he had come to the United States to explore investments and arrangements involving his tenants. At a time when checking the background of a foreign nobleman could take weeks or months, the story was extremely difficult to challenge. In Minnesota, influential people treated him like a man of immense wealth. Doors opened, favors were offered, and potential business partners gathered around him. But the greatest prize was Jay Gould, one of the most powerful and ruthless financiers in 19th century America, hardly the kind of man anyone would expect to become an easy target. Gordon convinced Gould that he represented wealthy European investors and could help him in a battle for control over railroad interests. Gould ultimately placed securities worth around $1 million in his hands, an extraordinary amount of money at the time. Instead of delivering the promised support, the Lord began disposing of the stock. Questions followed, and the financial arrangement quickly became a legal problem. Gordon was released on bail and fled to Canada. Gould was furious enough to send men across the border to seize him and bring him back. Canadian authorities arrested the would-be kidnappers, and what had started as a financial scam suddenly became a political dispute. In Minnesota, there were demands for the Americans to be released, and the rhetoric grew heated enough for people to talk about intervention. Meanwhile, information arrived from Europe linking the supposed Lord to earlier schemes carried out under other names and titles. His exact background remains murky even today, but the wealthy Scottish landowner he claimed to be was nowhere to be found. In 1874, as extradition and another trial became increasingly likely, Gordon died by suicide in Canada. In the spring of 2021, guests at Mar-a-Lago in Florida began encountering a woman they knew as Anna de Rothschild. It was an almost perfect name to carry into a room full of wealthy and politically connected people. one of Europe's most famous financial dynasties, centuries of old money, family assets, and a private world that most outsiders would have no realistic way to verify. The image matched the name. There was a Rolex, a new Mercedes AMG G63, and talk of expensive real estate projects. According to an investigation by OCCRP and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the woman repeatedly entered Mar-a-Lago, mixed with prominent political figures, and appeared in photographs around Donald Trump and his supporters. Guests later recalled hearing stories about a Rothschild-linked family development in the Bahamas. Journalists began checking the details. They could not find the heiress or the family project she described. The woman was identified as Inna Yashcheshin, who was born in Ukraine and had previously been connected to a Florida charity. Investigators obtained copies of documents bearing her photograph and the name Anna de Rothschild, including a driver's license listing the address of a luxury property where she did not actually live. But this story is more complicated than a straightforward case of impersonation. Yashcheshin denied that she had personally pretended to be a Rothschild and said other people involved in a dispute with her had created the documents and the false identity. Several Mar-a-Lago guests, on the other hand, told reporters they had heard her describe herself as a member of the famous family. Some of the central details therefore remain allegations rather than facts established in court. Even with that caveat, the result was remarkable. The persona of Anna de Rothschild gained access to a place frequented by a former US president, major donors, and influential political figures. Once the investigation was published, the story became about more than fake wealth. It raised an obvious question: how far could the right name and the right appearance get someone past both social and security checks? At the beginning of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie was more than a rich man. His name was shorthand for almost unimaginable wealth. His steel empire had made him one of the richest people on earth. Cassie Chadwick understood the power of that name and built her greatest deception around it. She claimed to be the illegitimate daughter of Carnegie. In 1902, Chadwick traveled to New York with a lawyer she knew and carefully staged a visit to the home of Carnegie. Afterward, she showed him documents that appeared to carry the industrialist's signature, promissory notes for $250,000 and $500,000, along with papers supposedly worth millions more. The explanation was simple. Carnegie could never publicly acknowledge his secret daughter, she said, but he supported her privately and would one day leave her an enormous inheritance. Then Chadwick told the lawyer not to reveal the secret. That may have been the smartest part of the entire scheme. The story spread rapidly through banking circles precisely because it was supposed to remain confidential. Each new banker heard it not from Chadwick herself, but from somebody he already trusted. Before long, her reputation was doing the work that proper verification should have done. Chadwick spent extravagantly. She bought jewelry, expensive clothes, furniture, and lavish gifts. The richer she appeared, the easier it became to borrow more money, and every new loan made it possible to look richer still. Banks and private lenders extended enormous sums against the fortune she was supposedly destined to inherit. The illusion finally collapsed when a creditor demanded repayment. Carnegie himself was drawn into the story and said he did not know Chadwick and had never signed the documents. One bank that had become deeply entangled in her borrowing failed after the scandal, and its president lost a large portion of his own fortune. Estimates vary, but historians often put her total take at more than $600,000 at the time, many millions in today's money. What makes the case so extraordinary is that Carnegie was alive the entire time. The bankers could have tried to contact him much earlier. Instead, the supposed secrecy surrounding the relationship made asking the obvious question feel almost inappropriate. Chadwick built a fortune on a secret that survived only because nobody wanted to be the first person to check whether it was real. In New York in the early 2020s, Kyle Deschanel looked like the kind of wealthy man who had no reason to prove anything. He attended expensive dinners, lived in prestigious apartments, spoke with investors, and projected the relaxed confidence of someone born into old European money. The Rothschild name appeared in conversations alongside Oxford, family offices, major deals, and access to capital most entrepreneurs only ever see in pitch decks. That image soon began working on his behalf. People brought him opportunities because they believed he could bring money. Vanity Fair later reported that Deschanel associated himself with an investment firm called Oxshott Capital and circulated materials involving well-known companies. Some of those organizations later said the relationships or documents presented to them were not legitimate. There were warning signs, unpaid debts, inconsistencies, details that did not quite fit, but they clashed with the overall picture people had already accepted. In the end, the thing that broke the illusion was not a forensic audit or a private investigator. It was a global entry card. During a trip, people close to Deschanel saw the government-issued card used for expedited border processing. It carried a different name, Arye Dodelson. That single detail opened the door to a past that looked nothing like the biography of a European heir. Vanity Fair connected Dodelson to an Orthodox Jewish community in New Jersey, where he had previously been known under his real name and had been active in the local religious community. The more journalists and former acquaintances compared stories, the less remained of the carefully constructed Kyle Deschanel. A person can control Instagram, clothing, presentations, and the stories he tells at dinner. Official records are harder to rewrite. One small plastic card proved more powerful than a luxury apartment and a network of impressive introductions. The Rothschild, known to part of New York's elite, effectively disappeared the moment his photograph was placed next to his real name. Anna Delvey was a perfect creation for a world where wealth often exists as a promise. She was supposedly a young German heiress with access to a family fortune of around $60 million. The money, however, was overseas, tied up in a trust, or temporarily difficult to move into an American account. It was a convenient explanation. Not being able to produce money today did not necessarily mean the money was not real. Under the Delvey name, Anna Sorokin entered New York's social scene. She stayed in expensive hotels, ate at fashionable restaurants, and spent time with people accustomed to enormous bills. Generous tips and an almost theatrical indifference to money created exactly the right impression. She did not look like someone desperately trying to become rich. She looked like an heiress who simply found banking details annoying. Her ambitions went far beyond getting free hotel rooms. Sorokin wanted to create a private arts club called the Anna Delvey Foundation in a prestigious Park Avenue property and sought tens of millions of dollars in financing. Banks and investors were shown documents suggesting substantial overseas assets. At one point, she was pursuing a loan of roughly $22 million. The cracks appeared whenever the luxurious image collided with the need to pay real bills on time. Hotels were left waiting. Banking transactions failed, and friends who had been promised quick repayment began asking uncomfortable questions. During the now famous trip to Morocco, part of an enormous bill ultimately fell on one of Sorokin's friends. By then, the story of the eccentric heiress was no longer amusing. In 2019, a New York jury convicted Sorokin on multiple counts, including grand larceny and theft of services. She was sentenced to 4 to 12 years in prison. Anna Sorokin was real. The German heiress, Anna Delvey, with tens of millions sitting in a European trust, was a character. Anthony Janak did not behave like a cautious impostor. He took the opposite approach. His fictional identity was so elaborate and so visible that questioning it could feel almost absurd. Investors did not meet a man merely claiming to be rich. They met Prince Khalid bin Al Saud, supposedly a member of the Saudi royal family, surrounded by security, diplomatic symbols, luxury gifts, and his own version of royal protocol. Janak bought traditional clothing and used business cards carrying titles such as Prince, Sultan, and His Royal Highness. On social media, he posted photographs of actual Saudi royals and used captions that implied close family relationships. His bodyguards displayed fake diplomatic credentials. Vehicles carried fraudulent diplomatic license plates. Potential business partners were even instructed on how to behave around the prince and what kinds of gifts were considered appropriate. The performance had a practical purpose. Through a fake investment company, Janak offered access to exclusive opportunities involving pharmaceutical businesses, hotels, casinos, aviation fuel, and even supposed interests connected to Saudi Aramco. Forged documents appeared to confirm both his royal status and his access to enormous wealth. Investors from several countries ultimately put about $8 million into the scheme. The money helped finance the very image used to attract more money. Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, yachts, jewelry, designer clothing, private jets, and a home on exclusive Fisher Island all became visual proof that the man standing in front of them really had to be a prince. Money from one victim paid for the evidence that persuaded the next. What makes the story even stranger is how long Janak kept returning to variations of the same royal persona. The US Department of Justice said he had been arrested or convicted 11 times since 1988 in cases involving similar prince-related schemes. Even after previous exposure, he simply changed details and tried again. In 2019, Janak was sentenced to 224 months in federal prison, more than 18 years. Until the deception finally collapsed, people who had no idea they were being conned continued following a royal protocol that he had invented himself. In the early 1990s, members of the prestigious St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue in New York met a man named Clark Rockefeller. He spoke and behaved like a member of America's old money elite, talked about family connections, and claimed to own an enormous art collection. The boldness of the lie was extraordinary for one reason. Actual Rockefellers attended the same church. Clark moved comfortably among educated and affluent people. Through friends, he met Sandra Boss, a Harvard Business School graduate. They became a couple, married, and stayed together for years. Her husband talked about his career, his family history, his wealth, and his art. Paintings on the walls were assumed to be expensive works by artists such as Rothko and Pollock. They, too, later turned out to be fake. There was one curious detail in the marriage. Despite Clark's famous name and supposed fortune, Sandra carried most of the financial burden. Yet almost every inconsistency could be explained away. Perhaps the Rockefeller family was eccentric. Perhaps there were inheritance disputes. Perhaps Clark simply had an unusual relationship with money. He remained in the role long enough for the couple to have a daughter, and for the people around him to stop treating his background as something that needed to be checked. Only during a bitter divorce did Sandra hire a private investigator. What came back was frightening, not because the investigator found a scandalous past, but because he could barely find a past at all. There was no normal Clark Rockefeller history to trace backward. The man Sandra had lived with for years seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. His real name was Christian Gerhardsreiter. He had arrived in the United States from Germany in 1978 and had been creating identities long before Clark Rockefeller existed. In California, he called himself Christopher Chichester and hinted at connections to British aristocracy. Later, he became Christopher Crowe and claimed ties to the film industry. After the divorce, the story became even stranger. In 2008, Gerhardsreiter kidnapped his 7-year-old daughter during a supervised visit and disappeared. He had already prepared another identity and was known by a different name in Baltimore. But this time, the publicity worked against a man who had survived for decades by keeping the different pieces of his life separate. He was recognized and arrested. Fingerprints connected the Rockefeller to earlier aliases. Then investigators returned to the old disappearance of a married couple, John and Linda Sohus, in California. Gerhardsreiter had lived near them while using the name Christopher Chichester. In 1994, John's remains were found buried on the property. Linda has never been found. In 2013, a jury convicted Gerhardsreiter of murdering John Sohus, and he was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Clark Rockefeller was not a temporary alias created for one deal. Under that name, Gerhardsreiter built an entire human life, a past, a career, friendships, a marriage, and a family. His wife eventually hired someone to discover the truth about the man she had married and learned that, In the most literal sense, Clark Rockefeller had never existed. These stories took place in different countries and different centuries, yet the mechanism barely changed. An impostor rarely needs to convince everyone. They only need to convince the first few people, because that trust becomes evidence for everybody else. Sometimes a carefully built identity survived for years before collapsing over a phone call, an old photograph, or a plastic card carrying the wrong name. And in every case, the entire illusion depended on one simple question that nobody asked soon enough. Who is this person really?